Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 54. Theresa May. The Impossible. Theresa May was Prime Minister between 2016 and 2019. Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. And this week our random number generator has come up with number 54, Theresa May. And we've given this episode the title, The Impossible. So before we move on, please give this episode a like. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Long History and Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Okay, let's get going with the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 54, Theresa May, The Impossible. It's interesting, when looking at more recent Prime Ministers, to see how the opinion is still quite raw. Certainly one biography we read about Theresa May is, well, excoriating about her time in the job, and from reading that account, it would be easy to conclude that Theresa May must be a candidate for one of the worst Prime Ministers ever. However, Theresa May is now the 47th Prime Minister we've written about for Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and, well, it's immediately obvious that this is just not the case. She's not that bad. She's not even close to the worst Prime Minister ever. Theresa May was dealt an impossible hand, and then the game didn't go her way. Yeah, she's got to take some of the credit or blame for the events of her time in office, but Theresa May wasn't uniquely unqualified to be Prime Minister. She was far from lazy and far from inexperienced. She began her tenure with purpose and direction, and her purported weaknesses have been strengths for other Prime Ministers. Her rigidity, her lack of PR sheen, her lack of easy charm. So what went wrong for Theresa May? Was she patently hopeless at the job, like, say, Archibald Primrose, the Earl of Rosebery from the 1890s? He liked the idea of being Prime Minister much more than the reality. Or was Theresa May a good Prime Minister in impossible circumstances, perhaps like someone like Herbert Asquith? He was a progressive, reforming peacetime Prime Minister who was soon booted out of the job when World War I required a more proactive man to lead from the front. Along came David Lloyd George. What is Theresa May like? Theresa May wasn't a successful Prime Minister. She took the job at one of the most perversely complex moments in the country's history. It's difficult to see how anyone could have risen to that occasion, and, given the circumstances, opinions vary widely about how her personality affected her time in the job. If longevity in the job is a significant criteria for success, May was a very successful Home Secretary. But this has led to assertions that what made her a successful Home Secretary went against her when she reached the job of Prime Minister. She was stern, cautious, risk-averse, rigid, and independent-minded rather than collegiate in her outlook. Whereas, it's been argued, the Prime Minister after the Brexit referendum needed to be someone who brought people together, was flexible and willing to take risks. Now, even as I say that, I'm not convinced either way, really. One trait that many successful Prime Ministers do have, however, is a subtle or possibly even a brazen ability to seem like they're agreeing with you, even when they're not. Theresa May was too straightforward to be like that, which can be seen as a good or a bad thing. May, at least from the reading for this essay, is conservative in the way that defined the Conservative Party originally. I don't think it's too controversial to say that Theresa May saw the Conservatives as a party that protected tradition but accepted change for the good of the country, in a way defined by Conservative Party luminaries such as Robert Peel, the first Conservative Prime Minister in the 1840s, and another one, Robert Gascoigne-Cecil, the Marquess of Salisbury, who was Prime Minister in the 1880s and 1890s. These two Prime Ministers epitomised and defined a Conservative Party Prime Minister in many ways. See the relevant episodes of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week for more details. In this 19th century, traditional Conservative sense, it can even be suggested that Theresa May was the last Conservative Prime Minister, even though there have been 3 Conservative Party Prime Ministers since Theresa May at the date of writing. It can be argued that none of these 3 successors were particularly Conservative, with Johnson's bold aim to get Brexit done, Truss's sudden jolt to the British establishment, and Sunak's aimlessness as the Conservatives sank. None of these 3 Prime Ministers governed in ways which seem Conservative in that traditional sense. Theresa May was notably the second female Prime Minister. It's interesting how May was judged differently from the many men who have been Prime Minister. For example, few men have been judged for their footwear, although having said that, the Wellington boot was named after the Duke of Wellington, a Prime Minister. Theresa May, in the meantime, in what was clearly a self-conscious choice, wore flamboyant footwear, and to a certain extent it seemed to work, gaining her publicity in a way that couldn't have happened with men, again for good or bad. Theresa May married Philip May in 1980. What was the historical background? It's striking how Theresa May was a Conservative Party Prime Minister at a precisely non-Conservative moment in the country's history. We've already mentioned Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury, and he proved popular in part because he served as a counterweight to the great changes that were taking place in society as a result of the Industrial Revolution and growing imperialism. And not unlike this late Victorian Prime Minister, Theresa May wasn't a loud person, she wasn't really a good communicator, and she left the showmanship to the others. Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the Marquis of Salisbury for example, preferred to leave the entertaining to Benjamin Disraeli, and for Theresa May, Boris Johnson could be relied on to provide such entertainment. And in this sense, Theresa May was perhaps the perfect modest Prime Minister for the moment. But whereas Gascoigne Cecil fended off change, for Theresa May, with that referendum result, the change had actually already happened. So the question was how she could deal with those fundamental developments as a Conservative person. When she took up the role in the summer of 2016, everything was about Brexit. The news was also dominated by David Cameron, May's predecessor, and his departure from the job of Prime Minister. Then there was the contest to replace him. May's time in office was completely dominated by the Brexit negotiations and machinations. They're difficult to sum up, but seem to involve a permanent, immovable impasse. What was happening in the United States at the time? Not long after May began as Prime Minister, another upheaval happened when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. He began his first term in office in January 2017. Who could vote? We ask this question in every episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, so we can trace the evolution of democracy over the years. May herself made no changes to the voting system, but there was a sense that democracy in the UK was being stretched to its limits at this time. May, for example, wasn't elected with a general election. She was chosen by Conservative Party members, so that didn't seem very democratic, really. And yet she was implementing the result of a referendum, something that had an unquestionable, albeit controversial, mandate. Prime Ministers in such a situation sometimes choose to hold an election, to give further legitimacy to their tenure and to shore up their majority. This is what Theresa May did, and as we'll see, the move went against her. Other democratic tensions came with the result of Brexit. After some point, there was no getting away from the fact that the Brexit changes were fundamental to the UK. During the referendum, Brexit had been treated something like a bureaucratic detail, with Cameron clearly expecting such nonsense to be rejected. Under May's tenure, however, the reality and the complexity of Brexit became apparent. It was a fundamental and even an existential change for the country, reconfiguring the UK's political, legal and trade relationships throughout Europe and the world. It became clear that people had voted for Brexit, even though no definition of the term had been laid out. This confusion was reflected on the 4th of December 2018, when May's government became the first ever government to be found in contempt of Parliament, because it hadn't made legal advice on the proposed Brexit agreement that had been put forward available to Parliament. From this point on, in retrospect, The end of May's premiership became inevitable. We're getting ahead of ourselves, however. What was Theresa May's background? She was born Theresa May Brazier on the 1st of October 1956 in a town on the southeastern coast of England called Eastbourne. She was brought up in Oxfordshire, where her father was a vicar, but both of her parents had died by the early 1980s, before she first became elected as a Member of Parliament. She was educated at a few schools in Oxfordshire, and then became one of the 31 Prime Ministers to study at Oxford University. She studied geography here. After university, she had a number of jobs, including working for the Bank of England and as a financial consultant. She first tried to become an MP in the 1992 general election, but had her first electoral success when she stood for Maidenhead in the 1997 general election. This led to her being one of the few Conservative women to break through into politics in this Labour-dominated election. How did Theresa May become Prime Minister? From that 1997 general election, for another 12 years, the Conservatives were in the political wilderness, during the administration of Labour Prime Ministers Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown. She perhaps first gained wider attention during her time in opposition when, famously, she said that people saw the Conservatives as the nasty party. She said this in October 2002. It was an astute and memorable phrase, which is perhaps why it stuck. She had various shadow roles while in opposition, including, over the years, Shadow Minister for Women and Equality and Shadow Secretary for Culture, Media and Sport. She then entered the front line of politics when, in 2010, David Cameron won his first general election and she became Home Secretary. May stayed in the job for a relatively long time, her 6-year stint being the longest period in that office for well over 6 decades. When David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister after losing the Brexit referendum, Theresa May stood in the leadership contest that followed. As with many aspects of the Brexit referendum, the vote to choose the next leader of the Conservatives, and hence who would be Prime Minister, was full of twists and turns. Future Prime Minister Boris Johnson was seen as a leading candidate, but withdrew from this race when Conservative colleague Michael Gove, who had previously supported Johnson, stated that his friend wasn't up to the job, and Gove then put himself forward as a candidate. During a series of votes, Gove himself was eliminated, and then the only other contender, Andrea Leadsom, also withdrew from the competition. After all that backstabbing, Theresa May emerged as the clear winner, and some have said the only adult in the room. What were Theresa May's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? May's tenure began and ended in the 2010s, yet even now her legacy is contentious. It can be said that she was unfit for the job of tackling the complexities of Brexit. But it can also be said that only someone with her diligence and hard work ethic could have balanced the conflicting interests of the day with any efficacy. She was handed a poisoned cup, and there's no surprise that the poison ended her premiership. Her tenure as Prime Minister began with the famous phrase, "Brexit means Brexit," a memorable phrase which helped her to overcome the issue that she'd been a Remainer before the referendum. The phrase, although much satirised, summarised her acceptance that now that Brexit had been won, Brexit had to be delivered. It quickly became apparent, however, that this famous phrase seemed decisive, yet was in fact ferociously vague. When her government began, it seemed she was correcting one of the obvious limitations of the previous Cameron government. The previous group in charge had been accused of being a chumocracy, of being just a little too full of similar, well-bred, posh chaps. May became Prime Minister on the 13th of July 2016 and tried to wipe the slate clean by getting rid of many of the people who'd been part of Cameron's government. It was an excellent way to stamp her personality on the top team. Or possibly it was the best way to annoy many powerful members of her party just when she needed them all to be on side. It might have been a good move in calmer times, a decisive break with the past, but in this case it was yet another way to split a party that had already been split in many ways over Brexit. Although May had many qualities as a leader perhaps, she wasn't a uniter of people. Nevertheless, things seemed to be going reasonably well during the first months of her premiership. However, she only had a slim majority. Riding a wave of that apparent popularity, May called a general election in May 2017, promising a government that would be strong and stable, notable Conservative values. However, as May came under more scrutiny, the awkwardness of her presentation, something which might not have been an issue in a pre-television age, went against her. She gambled with this general election and lost. Rather than uniting the country, the election showed how divided it was. Theresa May's majority was reduced, and from this point, her tenure just seemed to slowly unravel. Why did Theresa May stop being Prime Minister? By the end of May's tenure, there was a sense that she simply could not win. There are famous moments in party conferences during her tenure, with letters falling off the political slogan behind her, and then there's the bout of coughing she had during her speech. The 2018 Conservative conference is remembered because of her awkward walk onto stage, where she began dancing to ABBA's Dancing Queen. This attempt to show that she was energised for the job instead somehow just showed her lack of showmanship. After that general election, she seemed only to be clinging on to the job. After her government was found in contempt of Parliament in December 2018, as we've said, the woes continued to mount up. There were votes of no confidence, there was much wrangling over Brexit, and as the results were presented to Parliament, they were rejected a number of times, in particular in 3 so-called meaningful votes in January and March 2019. The way things went against her is reflected in the tears that she shed when she resigned. These can be interpreted in many ways, and certainly one interpretation is that they were tears of frustration by someone who tried to do a good job but just couldn't get it right. Like a striker who's constantly aiming for goal only to find the goalposts are randomly being moved by both teams. Theresa May resigned on the 24th of May 2019. Why should we remember Theresa May? In trying to work out how Theresa May fits with other Prime Ministers, we've already listed a lot of premiers who faced difficult challenges. However, in conclusion, one premier of those we have looked at so far in this series stands out. I might propose that Theresa May was, as a Conservative Prime Minister, not unlike Jim Callaghan was to Labour. They both epitomised their parties when they came to power. They were both respected and experienced. They both mistimed a general election. They came at the end of an era and somehow epitomised the recent past that was about to change. Somehow, despite being an ideal Conservative or an ideal Labour premier on paper, when they reached the top job they flopped, not least due to bad timing, exposing the end of that era. In this metaphor, they were King Canutes, put in place by their political parties and expected to order the tide back out. It was never going to happen. May, in particular, diligently tried to deal with the challenges in front of her, but in a weakened position after that mistimed general election, and dealing with an altogether impossible situation, she ended up mired in frustration. Brexit means Brexit, Theresa May said, but above all, her tenure exposed that simple phrase in all its horrendous complexity. For an unflamboyant leader, Theresa May has come up with 2 remarkably memorable phrases which have stuck. Brexit means Brexit and the nasty party. She's remembered for her shoes and her awkward dance, making this Conservative Prime Minister remarkably more memorable than many other Prime Ministers. Some commentators have been excoriating, but May wasn't the one who created the Brexit mess, and she tried to find a reasonable solution while exposing the unreasonableness of the situation. She tried to take this situation seriously before her successors found blunter ways to get Brexit done. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Please don't forget our usual disclaimer. There are many controversial details here, so please forgive us if we've got anything wrong, and just see this as your starting point to do your own research. Above all, thank you for listening to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 54, Theresa May, the Impossible. Goodbye.